Well, good evening, everyone. I have finally gotten to do our Bible study for tonight. I'm very sorry that it's so late, but I'm so glad that we can share at this time. Tonight's reading is what they call telescopic reading, and it centers around this passage in Lamentations that is so famous, so frequently quoted. The passage in Lamentations is chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. For the NIV says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The ESV, which is as close to the King James as I can get, says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." And of course, that's the verses that relate to the hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness," and one that is a favorite of mine from my early Christian days. Because of the Lord's faithful love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I'll continue reading in chapter 3 with verse 24. "I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." Back at verse 22, the Holman Christian Standard Bible reads, "Because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will put my hope in him." I heard another version quoted, another translation, and you know how sometimes just one word can open up new understanding. And it was in this area. Let me get something to mark that page that I'm on. Well, I won't go back to it. What I'd like to do is read from the book of 2 Kings, the background for this book of Lamentations, and fill you in on just what is going on in this Lamentations. We hardly ever camp on it or study it. I don't know that I've ever studied Lamentations like this before, but our study tonight directs us there, and this is the background for it. You know that a lament is a song of sadness. And in the book of Lamentations, the poet has put 5 poems down on paper, 5 poems, and each poem corresponds to a chapter in Lamentations. So you have 5 chapters, 5 poems. It was written, all 5 poems were written by a survivor of the great fall of Jerusalem, when the Babylonians overran Jerusalem and destroyed the city and the temple and carried off everything in the temple and many of the leaders in the city. And they carried off thousands of people and left behind only the poorest people in the land. We'll have some more detail as we read this background and how Jerusalem came to be overrun. You will hear in this description Jehoiakim, that's K-I-M, Jehoiakim, is one of the kings of Judah. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Zebidah, daughter of Pedaiah. She was from Rumah, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his fathers had done. This is the reason. The Lord had been patient with the kings of Israel and of Judah for hundreds of years, for centuries. He had been patient and sent prophets to tell them they were sinning, and they kept sinning. They did not repent and did not turn back from their evil ways. During Jehoiakim's reign, this is the first verse of chapter 24, 2 Kings. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord, now this is the Lord sent Babylonian, Aramaean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him. He sent them to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants the prophets. Surely these things happened in Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his fathers, and Jehoiakim, his son, succeeded him as king. It's the same spelling, except the very last letters are changed. C-H-I-N for the son, K-I-M for the father. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all his territory from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. This is verse 8. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, The officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed all the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace. All the treasures are gone now. And took away all the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried into exile all Jerusalem, all the officers and fighting men, and all the craftsmen and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 craftsmen and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. It was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end he thrust them from his presence. There's a little note in my Bible that tells me during Zedekiah's reign, idolatrous practices continued to increase in Jerusalem. He was a weak and indecisive ruler, who refused to heed the word of the Lord given through Jeremiah. And the reference here is 2 Chronicles 36, verse 12. So the evil continued, and God, in his anger, used the king of Babylon to thrust them, all these people, from his presence. They left only the poorest in the land of Israel, or what it was called Judah at that time. But the temple was down, the palace was down, the gates of the city were down. They just left it all in ruins. Now, this is going into chapter 25. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So that's 2 years' time. By the 9th day in the 4th month of the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled all night, or fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden. Though the Babylonians were surrounding the city, they fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. Just a word about the times. This was 588 BC when they started this siege, and then it was 586 BC when they broke through. Some scholars follow a different dating system and place the fall of Jerusalem in the summer of 587. So it was either July of 586 or the summer of 587. I'm going to take 586 BC. And now back to the story. They captured the king, and sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. The Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all that were made of pure gold or silver. The bronze from the 2 pillars, the sea, the movable stands, which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord, was more than could be weighed. Each pillar was 27 feet high. The bronze capital on top of one pillar was 4.5 feet high, and decorated with a network and pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar with its network was similar. The commander of the guard took as prisoners Seraiah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. Of those still in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisors. He also took the secretary, who was chief officer in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of his men who were found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them all and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. There at Riblah in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over the people he had left behind in Judah. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah as governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Netaniah, Johanan, son of Kariath, Seraiah, son of Temutheth, and the Methodist, and Jazaniah, the son of Mekadite, and their men. Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officers or officials, he said. Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you. In the 7th month, however, Ishmael, son of Netaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of the royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, and also the men of Judah and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah. At this, all the people from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. Jehoiakim, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year evil Merodach became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiakim from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. And this ends the reading of 2 Kings 24 and 25 to give you an idea of what happened and how brutal the exile was. Turning now to Lamentations. And if you'll go there with me in your Bibles, we'll take a look at this material. The study opens with this recommendation, and we'll fill in some of these blanks, but I want you to be thinking. It says, whenever you come to a book of the Bible, ask, where does this book fit historically? When was it written? When did the events take place? What was happening elsewhere in the world at that time? Many people are fond of quoting portions of today's passage. It speaks of God's great love and faithfulness and His compassions that never fail. What a positive and optimistic outlook, right? Not many people who quote these verses have put them in context. Our assignment today is to take a telescopic approach to this passage. Next to the telescopic approach, I'm saying we need to zoom out from the verses that are so familiar in chapter 3 and get a look at what surrounds them. If you step back and examine the passage in its context, you'll find that it sits right in the middle of the book of Lamentations, a series of funeral dirges or sad funeral songs. So first read Lamentations 3:22-33, the portion that so many people telescope into. How do these verses make you feel about God? And please record your thoughts in your notebook. And we just will read a bit and reflect on it, and then look at the feelings that that little bit of Lamentations brings up in us. Lamentations 3:22, bring praise and thanksgiving for the Lord's loving kindness, God's faithful love that keeps us alive. His compassions never end. I'll read again verse 22. This is verse 22 from Peterson's The Message. God's loyal love couldn't have run out. His merciful love couldn't have dried up. They are created new every morning. How great your faithfulness. And verse 24, I'm sticking with God. I say it over and over. He's all I've got left. The other versions say, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will put my hope in Him. Verse 25, the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the person who seeks Him. God proves to be good to the man who passionately waits, to the woman who diligently seeks. It is good. It is a good thing to quietly hope for help from God. Verse 26 from the Holman, it is good to wait quietly for deliverance from the Lord. The NIV says it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. So whether it is the salvation of the Lord, or deliverance from the Lord, or quiet hope from the Lord, and help from God, it is good to wait quietly. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Verse 27, it is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is still young. It's the idea that when you have burdens to bear, it's good to be young when you stick it out through these hard times, Peterson says. Lamentations 3:23, His mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Gratitude and praise come from these verses. And thanks for the Lord's loving kindness and His faithful love and His compassions which never fail, never end. The Lord is my portion. He is my all. He is enough. I hope in God. I will place my trust in God. God is everything to me. He alone is the one I will trust and in whom I will hope. So my trust and my hope is in God. Take a look at verse 25. The Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to those who hope in Him. He rewards the person who seeks Him. Verse 26, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord, for deliverance from the Lord, to quietly hope for help from God. Lamentations 3:27, it is good for a man to bear the yoke of hard times when he is young. 3:28, let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid the hard times on him. God has disciplined him. Discipline doesn't feel good at the time, but when we reflect on it later, we are grateful to God for His love and His care. I desire to have the character that seeks Him in everything. I desire to be one who waits on Him in prayerful anticipation and who hopes in God alone. I desire to be one who waits quietly for deliverance. I trust in the Lord even in the hard times of my old age, and there have been plenty. I wait that I might receive the Lord's discipline and learn the lessons He has for me to learn. I'm okay with waiting, but I need to work on waiting in silence. Lamentations 3:29, especially in hard times, bow in prayer. Bury your face in the dust in prayer. Peterson says, don't ask questions. Perhaps there is still hope. Wait for hope to appear. Lamentations 3:30, let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. Let him be filled with shame, the one going through hard times, disgrace, and the ESV says insults. Lamentations 3:31, why? Because the Lord will not cast us off or reject us forever. The Lord is faithful and hears my prayers. I have not lost all hope. But I live in a house that has little hope. The Lord opens up so much to us when we wait and don't rush off with the most recent emotion. Emotions are supposed to be indicators for us. They change as time passes. One way to gain perspective is to wait on the Lord. I also need help taking a punch and not returning it. I have to be really disciplined to offer my cheek to be struck again. And it's helpful to know that this discipline is coming from the Lord. Lord, I'd like you to be so strong in me that I would be free to do just that. If people insult me or disgrace me or cause me to feel shame, let me bear it patiently and bring it to you, Lord. Forgive me of my sin and return to my heart where we can fellowship together. Lamentations 3:32, even if the Lord causes suffering, he will show compassion. According to his abundant, faithful love, he will show compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. He will show compassion, so great is his unfailing love. He will show compassion according to his abundant, faithful love. If he works severely, he also works tenderly. His stockpile of loyal love are immense. Lamentations 3:33, for he does not willingly, he does not enjoy bringing affliction from his heart or grief or suffering to anyone. He takes no pleasure in making life hard, in throwing roadblocks in the way. While I do not believe the Lord causes suffering, I do believe he allows it. I'm grateful for his abundant, faithful love and compassion. Thank you for working thoroughly and tenderly. Every time temptations come, please allow me to see clearly the exits you have designed for me, and continue to show me your mercy out of your stockpiles of loyal love that are inexhaustible. Thank you that my hardships are not joyful to you. You suffer alongside me. Thank you, Father, for the fellowship we share through the good and the bad. And may these sufferings, the sufferings that we go through from time to time, be a way for me to join Christ in his sufferings, the sufferings that he experienced on the cross for my sin and for yours. He invites us to come and share in his sufferings, that we might know a little bit of the extent of what he suffered for us. And now the study suggests that the book of Lamentations isn't very long. Read it straight through in order to put the previous verses into their context. And as you read these 5 chapters, make a list of events that are taking place during this time. If you don't find war, cannibalism, and worse, you're not looking hard enough. You might also want to consult a commentary to get more of a historical perspective on the conflicts described. But one of the greatest resources for us has been the Bible Project. You can find the Bible Project online. Just enter it into your Google browser or into your internet browser. There are resources from the Bible Project. One is called Lamentations, an Overview. And there's another one on Jeremiah the prophet that is also very helpful. Let me skip down to the material that comes to us from the Bible Project. It gives us a very nice overview of Lamentations and helps us to find some sense in all of it that we see before us. The story of the siege of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon I read in 2 Kings 24 and 25 as our background. The author or poet survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and exile that followed. Our poet, Jeremiah, was an eyewitness of the things that happened, and he shares in these poems his trauma. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile of all their brightest and best people was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. And remember these landmarks in Israel's history. God promised Abraham the land. God gave David victory to make Jerusalem his capital. And David came, and from David came the royal line of kings. Solomon built the temple where the presence of God would dwell. The temple is where the priests maintain the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all this history, in the summer of 587 BC, maybe 586, the city of Jerusalem fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the book of Lamentations is a memorial. Think of it as a memorial statue, a memorial book to the city of Jerusalem. It's a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that follow this destruction. The book of Lamentations is unique in the Old Testament as it is laid out in a series of 5 poems. The lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There are lament poems in the book of Psalms and sprinkled through the other prophets who prophesied in the Bible, in the Old Testament. The poems of lament do a number of things. Let me set my Bible over here and we can talk some more about the poems. And the things that those poems of lament do for us, they are a form of protest. They are a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in their world that should not be tolerated. The poems are a way of processing emotions. In these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. These poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises. And none of this is looked down upon in the Bible, just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. The design is part of the book's message. Chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means that each poem, each poetic verse, begins with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. And each verse gets the next consecutive letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, this very ordered and linear structure stands in stark contrast to the disorder and confused grief that is explored in these poems. So it is like Israel's suffering is explored from A to Z. and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have one verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, and you can look at them. They have 22 verses, each one of them, but the themes are very different. Chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of the figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow. Also, she is called the daughter of Zion. She sits alone. She is bereaved of her loved ones. She is devastated, and no one comes to comfort her. It is a very powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet is showing that the destruction of Jerusalem brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites. The trauma can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral after the death of a loved one. Chapter 2, although in a similar poetic form, focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin. It was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in the poem of chapter 2. It is important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath isn't spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets used this word to talk about God's justice. Remember, Israel had entered into a covenant agreement with God, but for centuries, for hundreds of years, they had been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice on people, and oppressing the poor. Yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil. God will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this punishment involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city and the nation. Chapter 2 acknowledges that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3, in the center, breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter. So chapter 3 is the longest poem in the book, 66 verses. The voice is that of a single lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. It is interesting that this chapter is full of language drawn from other parts of the Old Testament. Parts are from the laments of Job. Some are from other important lament psalms. Some are even from the suffering servant poems of Isaiah. The poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said. But paradoxically, God's justice is what gives the poet hope, and it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. 3 verses 21 through 33. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They are new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God! So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise not to allow evil to get the final word. So for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope for the future. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2. This chapter is a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem, and it contrasts with how things used to be in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem of the past, and how terrible they became in the siege. Children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. There are a few more parallels that I'll share with you. The wealthy used to eat meals, lavish meals. Now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. The royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they are famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away in chains. The poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts. It is exploring the depths of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern, but it's the same length, 22 verses, as the other poems in chapters 1, 2, and 4. This is chapter 5. It is like the poet can't hold the form and his emotions together anymore, and his grief explodes back into chaos. The poem in chapter 5 is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering and not to abandon them. The poem offers a long list of all the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to the pain of others. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions. They are instead asked to voice their protest, to vent their feelings, and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that the Lord is the eternal King of the world who reigns forever, verse 19, but also that Israel's circumstances makes them feel like God is nowhere to be found, verse 20. The final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks in verse 21, "Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old." Verse 22, "Unless you've totally rejected us." And the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion like our own experiences of pain and suffering. There's no nice, neat conclusion to them. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of the faith of God's people in a broken world. If you will go to the Bible Project and see that overview of Lamentations, it has some wonderful graphics to go with it. And now reread Lamentations 3:23-33. Does the significance of this passage change from your previous readings? And in what ways? And record those for yourselves in your notebook. And this ends this Bible study tonight, the Bible study of Lamentations. Thank you again for being with me. May God bless you, and through Sunday, when I hope I'll get to see you there again. May God bless you and keep you. Thank you. Good night.